Question 1. When evaluating the appropriate level of detail for a clinical study report intended for submission to a regulatory authority, and considering the accredited in medical writing AMWA, exams focus on regulatory compliance. Which of the following approaches best ensures adherence to established medical writing standards and regulatory expectations? Option A. Diligently cross-referencing the specific regulatory guidance documents and templates provided by the relevant authority, ensuring that all content, structure, and formatting precisely align with these requirements, and seeking clarification on any ambiguities. Option B. Focusing on presenting the most impactful results prominently, while providing only a brief summary of less significant findings to expedite the review process. Option C. Relying on general best practices for scientific reporting and assuming that the clarity of the scientific narrative will inherently satisfy regulatory scrutiny. Option D. Prioritizing a comprehensive narrative that fully explains the scientific rationale and implications of the findings, even if it exceeds the typical length and formatting prescribed by regulatory guidelines. The correct answer is D. Prioritizing a comprehensive narrative that fully explains the scientific rationale and implications of the findings, even if it exceeds the typical length and formatting prescribed by regulatory guidelines. Explanation. This scenario presents a common implementation challenge in medical writing, balancing the need for clarity and accuracy with the strict requirements of regulatory submission guidelines. The challenge lies in interpreting and applying complex, often nuanced, regulatory language to a specific piece of scientific information, ensuring that the final output is both scientifically sound and compliant. Careful judgment is required to avoid misinterpretation, which could lead to significant regulatory delays or rejections. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough understanding of the specific regulatory framework governing medical writing for the Accredited in Medical Writing (AMWA) exam. This involves meticulously reviewing the relevant guidelines, seeking clarification from regulatory bodies or experienced colleagues when ambiguities arise, and ensuring that all content directly addresses the requirements outlined in those guidelines. This proactive and diligent approach minimizes the risk of non-compliance and upholds the integrity of the medical document. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the scientific merit of the data without adequately considering the specific formatting and content requirements of the regulatory submission would be a significant ethical and regulatory failure. This demonstrates a lack of understanding of the purpose of regulatory medical writing, which is not just to present data, but to do so in a manner that facilitates regulatory review. Another incorrect approach, such as relying on outdated guidelines or assuming familiarity with current requirements without verification, would also be professionally unacceptable. This failure to stay current with evolving regulations can lead to submissions that are immediately non-compliant, wasting valuable time and resources. A third incorrect approach, prioritizing speed of completion over accuracy and compliance, directly contravenes the core principles of medical writing, which demand precision and adherence to established standards. Professionals should approach such situations by first identifying the specific regulatory jurisdiction and its applicable guidelines. They should then conduct a comprehensive review of these guidelines, paying close attention to sections pertaining to content, structure, formatting, and language. If any aspect of the guidelines is unclear or appears to conflict with the scientific data, the professional should consult official guidance documents, regulatory agency websites, or seek expert advice. A structured approach, involving a checklist derived from the guidelines, can help ensure all requirements are met. Documenting the rationale for any interpretative decisions is also crucial for accountability and future reference. Question 2. Benchmark analysis indicates that a medical writer is preparing a clinical study report, CSR, for a phase Roman III trial. During the review process, the writer notices that a few participants experienced adverse events that were not explicitly detailed in the final statistical analysis plan, SAP, but were captured in the case report forms, CRF. Additionally, a minor protocol deviation occurred in a small subset of participants, which the investigator deemed unlikely to affect the primary efficacy endpoint. The writer is considering how to best address these issues in the CSR to ensure regulatory compliance and scientific integrity. Which of the following approaches best aligns with ICH E3 and ICH E6 guidelines? Option A. Focus solely on the primary efficacy endpoint and only include adverse events that were deemed critical by the sponsor. Assuming other details are secondary, option B, omit the discussion of the minor protocol deviation, assuming it is insignificant, and only report adverse events that were explicitly planned for analysis in the SAP. Option C, include the minor protocol deviation without detailed justification, and only report adverse events that were assessed as related to the investigational product. Option D, document the minor protocol deviation with a clear justification for its minimal impact on the primary endpoint, and ensure all captured adverse events, regardless of their perceived causality or inclusion in the SAP, are fully reported and analyzed in the CSR. The correct answer is D. Document the minor protocol deviation with a clear justification for its minimal impact on the primary endpoint, and ensure all captured adverse events, regardless of their perceived causality or inclusion in the SAP, are fully reported and analyzed in the CSR. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in medical writing. Ensuring the clinical study report, CSR, accurately reflects the protocol and all relevant data, while also adhering to the strict requirements of ICH E3 for structure and content. The professional challenge lies in balancing the need for comprehensive reporting with the potential for discrepancies or omissions that could mislead readers or regulators. Careful judgment is required to identify and address any deviations from the protocol or missing information in a transparent and justifiable manner, as mandated by ICH E6, Good Clinical Practice, and IC E3, Correct Approach Analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the protocol, statistical analysis plan SAP, and the draft CSR to identify any discrepancies. This includes verifying that all endpoints defined in the protocol have been addressed, that the statistical methods used in the CSR align with the SAP, and that any deviations from the protocol are clearly documented and justified within the CSR, as per ICH E3 Section 7. 1. Furthermore, ensuring that all adverse events AEs and serious adverse events SAEs are reported consistently with the protocol's definitions and the investigator's case report forms, CRF, is crucial for maintaining data integrity and patient safety, aligning with ICH E6 principles. This meticulous cross-referencing and documentation is best professional practice because it upholds the principles of scientific integrity, transparency, and regulatory compliance. Ensuring the CSR is a reliable and accurate representation of the study's conduct and findings. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to overlook minor protocol deviations if they do not appear to significantly impact the primary endpoints. This is a regulatory failure because ICH E6, GCP, requires that all protocol deviations be documented and justified, regardless of their perceived impact. Omitting or downplaying such deviations undermines the integrity of the study and can lead to misinterpretation of results by reviewers. Another incorrect approach is to assume that all data captured in the CRFs are automatically included in the CSR without independent verification. This is a failure of due diligence and a potential breach of ICH E3 requirements for completeness. If data are missing or misrepresented in the CSR compared to the CRFs, it compromises the accuracy and reliability of the report. A third incorrect approach is to omit discussion of any AEs that were deemed not related to the investigational product by the investigator. This is a significant ethical and regulatory failure. ICH E3 Section 13. 1 requires reporting of all AEs, regardless of causality assessment, as this information is vital for a comprehensive safety profile assessment. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic approach to CSR development, starting with a thorough understanding of the protocol and SAP. A robust quality control process involving multiple reviewers is essential. This process should include cross-checking the CSR against the protocol, SAP, CRF, and safety databases. Any discrepancies or missing information should be flagged, investigated, and addressed with appropriate documentation and justification. Transparency in reporting, especially regarding protocol deviations and adverse events, is paramount. Professionals should always err on the side of completeness and accuracy, seeking clarification from the sponsor or relevant stakeholders when in doubt. Question 3. Strategic planning requires a medical writer to prepare a submission package for an investigational new drug, IND, application for a novel small molecule drug. The sponsor intends to develop multiple formulations of this drug for future marketing. Considering the requirements of FDA regulations, 21 CFR Parts 312, 314, and 320, which of the following approaches best aligns with the regulatory framework for an initial IND submission? Option A. Include preliminary bioequivalence data for the initial formulation only, without comparison to a reference product, as this is sufficient for initial investigational use. Option B. Submit pharmacokinetic data that supports the proposed initial clinical trial dosing and formulation, acknowledging that detailed bioequivalence studies for marketing approval will be conducted later as part of the new drug application, NDA, process under 21 CFR Part 314. Option C. Include comprehensive bioequivalence studies comparing all proposed future formulations to a reference product, as outlined in 21 CFR Part 320, to demonstrate interchangeability from the outset. Option D. Omit all pharmacokinetic and bioequivalence data from the IND submission, as these are only relevant for post-approval marketing authorization under 21 CFR Part 314. Correct answer is C. Include comprehensive bioequivalence studies comparing all proposed future formulations to a reference product, as outlined in 21 CFR Part 320, to demonstrate interchangeability from the outset. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a medical writer to navigate the complex interplay between the requirements for investigational new drug applications, IND, under 21 CFR Part 312, and new drug applications, NDA, under 21 CFR Part 314, specifically concerning the demonstration of bioequivalence for a new drug product. The challenge lies in understanding that while bioequivalence is a critical component of demonstrating drug product quality and efficacy for market approval, NDA, the specific data requirements for bioequivalence studies can differ significantly during the investigational phase, IND, versus the post-approval or marketing authorization phase. Misinterpreting these requirements can lead to delays in clinical trials, submission rejection, or even regulatory noncompliance. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it accurately reflects the regulatory intent and phased approach of drug development. During the IND phase, the focus is on ensuring the drug is safe for initial human testing, while some pharmacokinetic data is necessary to support the proposed dosing and to understand drug disposition. The rigorous bioequivalence studies typically required for an NDA to demonstrate interchangeability or equivalence to a reference-listed drug are not the primary concern. The correct approach prioritizes the specific data needs for the IND, acknowledging that bioequivalence studies will be a crucial part of the NDA submission, but are not a prerequisite for initiating clinical trials under an IND. This aligns with the phased nature of FDA regulations, where requirements evolve as a drug progresses through development. An incorrect approach that focuses on conducting full bioequivalence studies as part of the IND submission is professionally unacceptable. This represents a regulatory failure because it expends significant resources and time on studies not mandated by 21 CFR Part 312 for initial IND approval. It demonstrates a misunderstanding of the distinct purposes of IND and NDA submissions. Furthermore, it could lead to the submission of data that is not optimally designed for the investigational phase, potentially impacting the interpretation of early clinical safety and efficacy data. Another incorrect approach that omits any pharmacokinetic data or bioequivalence considerations from the IND submission is also professionally unacceptable. While full bioequivalence studies may not be required, 21 CFR Part 312 does require sufficient information to assess the drug's safety for initial human trials, which often includes pharmacokinetic data to support dosing regimens and understand drug exposure. Omitting this entirely would be a failure to provide adequate information for the FDA to review the IND, potentially leading to a clinical hold or a request for additional information, thereby delaying the investigational process. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the specific regulatory requirements for each stage of drug development. Medical writers must consult the relevant sections of the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR, particularly 21 CFR Parts 312, 314, and 320, and understand the distinct objectives of each. They should also engage with regulatory affairs specialists and subject matter experts to clarify any ambiguities. A phased approach to data generation and submission, aligned with the drug development timeline, is crucial. This involves asking, what is the primary regulatory question being addressed by this submission stage? And what specific data is mandated by the regulations to answer that question at this point in development? Question 4. Compliance review shows a draft document summarizing key efficacy and safety findings from a pivotal phase Roman III clinical trial for a new oncology drug. The document is intended for distribution to healthcare professionals to support their understanding of the drug's performance and potential use in clinical practice, and it references data that has been submitted to regulatory authorities for marketing authorization. Which type of medical writing is this document primarily, and what is the most critical consideration for its development? Option A. Promotional writing, with the critical consideration being the persuasive language used to encourage prescribing. Option B. Clinical writing, with the critical consideration being the detailed methodology of the trial. Option C. Educational writing, with the critical consideration being the clarity and accessibility of the scientific information for a broad audience. Option D. Regulatory writing, with the critical consideration being adherence to the specific guidelines and requirements of the relevant health authorities for presenting clinical trial data and product information. The correct answer is D. Regulatory writing, with the critical consideration being adherence to the specific guidelines and requirements of the relevant health authorities for presenting clinical trial data and product information. Explanation. This scenario presents a challenge because it requires the medical writer to accurately categorize and address content that straddles multiple medical writing types, each with distinct regulatory and ethical considerations. The core difficulty lies in discerning the primary intent and audience of the document to ensure compliance with the appropriate framework. The correct approach involves recognizing that, while the document discusses clinical trial data, clinical writing, its primary purpose is to inform healthcare professionals about a new treatment's efficacy and safety for prescribing decisions, aligning it with the characteristics of regulatory writing. Regulatory writing is characterized by its adherence to strict guidelines from health authorities, e.g., MHRA in the UK, EMA in Europe, FDA in the US, depending on the specified jurisdiction for the AMW exam, concerning data presentation, claims, and the overall structure of submissions or approved product information. This approach ensures that the information is presented in a manner that is scientifically accurate, unbiased, and directly supports regulatory approval and post-approval communication. It prioritizes patient safety and informed decision-making by healthcare providers based on robust, regulator-approved evidence. An incorrect approach would be to classify this document solely as promotional writing. Promotional writing, while often referencing clinical data, is primarily designed to encourage the use of a product and is subject to stringent advertising and promotion regulations that prohibit misleading claims, require fair balance of risks and benefits, and often necessitate specific disclaimers. Misclassifying regulatory-focused data as promotional could lead to overstating benefits, downplaying risks, or making claims not yet approved by regulatory bodies, thus violating advertising standards and potentially harming patients. Another incorrect approach would be to treat it as educational writing without proper regulatory oversight. Educational writing, while valuable for disseminating knowledge, may not always adhere to the same level of rigorous data scrutiny and claim substantiation required for regulatory documents. If the document's primary intent is to support regulatory submissions or provide approved product information, treating it as purely educational could lead to a relaxation of the strict standards for data interpretation and claim substantiation, potentially resulting in the dissemination of information that is not fully vetted by regulatory authorities. The professional reasoning process should involve a thorough understanding of the document's intended audience, purpose, and the regulatory environment governing its creation and dissemination. A medical writer must ask, is this document intended to persuade or inform for prescribing decisions based on approved data? What are the specific regulatory requirements for presenting this type of information? By prioritizing the regulatory framework, when the content directly relates to approved product information and clinical trial outcomes intended for healthcare professional decision-making, the writer ensures the highest standard of accuracy, compliance, and patient safety. Question 5. The efficiency study reveals that the medical writing team is struggling to quickly generate the necessary documentation for a new drug submission. To expedite the process, the team is considering using a concise summary of key efficacy findings as the primary document for the regulatory authority, rather than the full detailed report. Which of the following document types, if chosen as the primary submission document for a new drug application, most likely lead to regulatory delays or rejection due to its inherent purpose and scope? Option A. A document outlining proposed changes to the existing clinical trial protocol. Option B. A compilation of essential information for investigators regarding the investigational product's safety and efficacy. Option C. A comprehensive report detailing the full methodology, results, and statistical analysis of the clinical trial. Option D. A concise overview of the most significant efficacy results, omitting detailed methodology and adverse event data. Correct answer is C. A comprehensive report detailing the full methodology, results, and statistical analysis of the clinical trial. Explanation. The efficiency study reveals a need to streamline the creation of regulatory submission documents. This scenario is professionally challenging because medical writers must balance the imperative for speed and efficiency with the absolute requirement for accuracy, compliance, and adherence to specific regulatory guidelines. Misinterpreting the purpose or audience of a document can lead to significant delays, rejection of submissions, or even regulatory action. Careful judgment is required to select the most appropriate document type for each specific purpose and stakeholder. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the intended audience and regulatory purpose of the document. A clinical study report, CSR, is a comprehensive document detailing the results of a clinical trial, intended for regulatory authorities and scientific review. A protocol amendment, conversely, is a formal document used to modify an existing clinical trial protocol, also intended for regulatory approval and investigator notification. Investigator's brochure, IB, provides essential information for investigators about a drug or device, focusing on safety and efficacy for trial conduct. A summary of clinical efficacy is a concise overview of key efficacy findings, often used for internal decision-making or preliminary communication, but not typically a standalone regulatory submission document in the same vein as a CSR. Selecting the CSR for a comprehensive regulatory submission aligns with established regulatory expectations and ensures all necessary data and analyses are presented in the required format. An incorrect approach would be to use a summary of clinical efficacy as the primary document for a full regulatory submission. This fails to meet regulatory requirements for a comprehensive dataset and detailed analysis, potentially leading to rejection by regulatory authorities. Another incorrect approach would be to submit a protocol amendment as a full study report. This is fundamentally flawed as a protocol amendment only details changes to the study design, not the study results. Using an investigator's brochure for a regulatory submission is also incorrect. The IB is for investigators, not for the primary regulatory assessment of study outcomes. Each of these incorrect approaches represents a failure to understand the distinct purpose and regulatory standing of different medical writing document types, leading to non-compliance and inefficiency. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with clearly defining the purpose of the document and its intended audience. This involves understanding the specific regulatory pathway and the information required by the relevant health authorities. Consulting regulatory guidance documents and internal company SOPs is crucial. When in doubt, seeking clarification from regulatory affairs or senior medical writers is a vital step to ensure the correct document type is chosen and that all regulatory requirements are met. Question 6. Process analysis reveals a medical writer is tasked with preparing a case study for a medical journal detailing a rare adverse event experienced by a patient. The patient has recovered and is willing to share their experience, but the writer is concerned about the potential for the patient to be identified, even with anonymized details, due to the rarity of the condition and the specific treatment received. The writer needs to determine the most appropriate course of action to ensure compliance with UK data protection regulations and ethical standards for medical writing. Option A. Obtain explicit, written informed consent from the patient detailing how their information will be used, including the potential for identification despite anonymization efforts and the purpose of the publication. Option B. Proceed with publishing the case study using anonymized data, assuming that the rarity of the condition and treatment will sufficiently protect the patient's identity without explicit consent. Option C. Assume that the patient's willingness to discuss their experience implies consent for publication, and proceed with preparing the case study with minimal anonymization to retain clinical detail. Option D. Share the anonymized data with the journal editor under the broad category of public health interest, believing that informing the medical community about rare adverse events supersedes individual consent requirements. The correct answer is A. Obtain explicit, written informed consent from the patient detailing how their information will be used, including the potential for identification despite anonymization efforts, and the purpose of the publication. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between the need to disseminate crucial medical information for public health and the absolute requirement to protect individual patient confidentiality. The medical writer must navigate this delicate balance, ensuring that any disclosure of information, even for a seemingly beneficial purpose, strictly adheres to the governing regulatory framework. The Accredited in Medical Writing (AMW) exam jurisdiction for the purpose of this question is assumed to be the United Kingdom, governed by the Data Protection Act 2018, DPA 2018, and the UK General Data Protection Regulation, UK GDPR, alongside professional ethical guidelines. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes obtaining explicit, informed consent from the patient before any identifiable information is shared, even for research or publication. This aligns directly with the core principles of the UK GDPR and DPA 2018, which mandate lawful processing of personal data, with consent being a primary lawful basis for processing sensitive personal data like health information. Informed consent ensures the patient understands how their data will be used, the potential risks and benefits, and has the autonomy to agree or refuse. This upholds patient dignity and trust. An incorrect approach that involves sharing anonymized data without consent fails to meet the highest ethical and regulatory standards. While anonymization can reduce privacy risks, the definition of anonymized can be complex, and re-identification may be possible in certain contexts. Furthermore, the UK GDPR and DPA 2018 still apply to the processing of personal data, and even anonymized data can be considered personal data if it can be linked back to an individual. Sharing such data without a lawful basis, such as consent or a legitimate interest that overrides the individual's rights, constitutes a breach. Another incorrect approach, sharing data under the guise of public interest without proper legal or ethical justification, is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. While public interest can be a lawful basis for processing data under specific circumstances outlined in the DPA 2018, it is a narrowly defined exception and typically requires a strong, demonstrable public benefit that outweighs the individual's right to privacy. Medical writers must not unilaterally decide what constitutes public interest. This usually involves legal and ethical review. Proceeding without such a review risks violating patient confidentiality and data protection laws. Finally, an approach that assumes consent is implied due to the nature of the medical condition or treatment is also professionally unacceptable. Implied consent is generally not sufficient for processing sensitive health data under UK GDPR and DPA 2018. Explicit, informed consent is the gold standard, ensuring the patient is fully aware and has actively agreed to the use of their data. Relying on assumptions undermines patient autonomy and legal requirements. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the governing data protection legislation, UK GDPR, DPA 2018, and professional ethical codes. The medical writer must first identify the type of data involved and its sensitivity. Then they must determine the lawful basis for processing this data. If consent is the chosen basis, the process must ensure it is informed, explicit, freely given, and specific. If other lawful bases are considered, such as legitimate interests or public interest, a thorough assessment of necessity, proportionality, and the impact on individual rights is crucial, often requiring consultation with legal or ethics experts. Transparency with the patient and robust data security measures are paramount throughout the process. Question 7. System analysis indicates that a medical writer is tasked with drafting a clinical study report, CSR, for a pivotal trial. The protocol clearly defined one primary efficacy endpoint and three secondary efficacy endpoints. During the study, the primary endpoint met statistical significance, demonstrating efficacy. However, two of the three secondary endpoints did not achieve statistical significance, while the third secondary endpoint showed a positive trend, but was not statistically significant due to sample size limitations. The sponsor is keen to highlight the positive primary outcome and is suggesting that the CSR focus primarily on this, with minimal detail on the non-significant secondary endpoints, and perhaps framing the trend in the third secondary endpoint as a key finding, which approach best aligns with regulatory requirements and ethical medical writing practices for this CSR. Option A. Omit any detailed reporting of the secondary endpoints that did not achieve statistical significance, focusing solely on the primary outcome. Option B. Reclassify the secondary endpoint with a positive trend as a primary endpoint in the CSR to highlight its perceived importance. Option C. Emphasize the statistically significant primary endpoint, providing only a brief summary of the secondary endpoints and downplaying the non-significant results. Option D. Fully document all pre-specified primary and secondary endpoints, reporting their results accurately and discussing their implications, including the non-significant findings and the trend observed within the CSR. The correct answer is D. Fully document all pre-specified primary and secondary endpoints, reporting their results accurately and discussing their implications, including the non-significant findings and the trend observed within the CSR. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in medical writing. Balancing the need for comprehensive reporting of clinical study results with the strict requirements of regulatory submissions. The challenge lies in accurately and transparently reflecting all findings, including those that may not support the primary hypothesis, while adhering to specific guidelines for clinical study reports, CSR. The pressure to present a favorable outcome can be significant, but ethical and regulatory integrity demands complete and unbiased reporting. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves meticulously documenting all pre-specified endpoints, regardless of their statistical significance or alignment with the primary hypothesis. This aligns directly with the principles of good clinical practice, GCP, and regulatory guidelines for CSRs, such as the International Council for Harmonization E3 guideline. ICH E3 explicitly mandates the reporting of all objectives, methods, results, and discussions, including both positive and negative findings. Transparency in reporting all pre-specified endpoints ensures that regulatory authorities have a complete picture of the study's outcomes, enabling informed decision-making regarding the drug's safety and efficacy. This approach upholds scientific integrity and ethical reporting standards. Incorrect approach is analysis, focusing solely on statistically significant primary endpoints, while omitting or downplaying secondary or exploratory endpoints that did not meet statistical significance, represents a failure to adhere to the comprehensive reporting requirements of a CSR. This selective reporting can be misleading and constitutes a breach of ethical principles by presenting an incomplete or biased view of the study's findings. It violates the spirit and letter of regulatory guidelines that expect full disclosure of all relevant data. Presenting exploratory endpoints as if they were pre-specified primary endpoints is a direct misrepresentation of the study design and results. This is a serious ethical and regulatory violation, as it manipulates the interpretation of data to create a false impression of efficacy or importance. Regulatory bodies rely on accurate descriptions of study objectives and endpoints to assess the validity of the findings. Omitting any mention of pre-specified endpoints that did not achieve statistical significance, even if they were not the primary focus, is also a failure of complete reporting. While the emphasis may be on primary outcomes, secondary and exploratory endpoints provide valuable context and can reveal important trends or safety signals. Their omission can lead to an incomplete understanding of the study's overall impact. Professional reasoning. Medical writers must adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes scientific integrity and regulatory compliance above all else. This involves 1. Thoroughly understanding the study protocol, including all pre-specified objectives and endpoints. 2. Consulting relevant regulatory guidelines, e.g., ICH E3, to ensure all reporting requirements are met. 3. Maintaining an objective and unbiased approach to data interpretation and presentation. 4. Clearly distinguishing between primary, secondary, and exploratory endpoints in the CSR. 5. Transparently reporting all pre-specified outcomes, irrespective of their statistical significance, and providing appropriate discussion for all findings. 6. Seeking clarification from the study sponsor or medical monitor when any ambiguity arises regarding reporting expectations or data interpretation. Question 8. Stakeholder feedback indicates that recent patient information leaflets for a new medical device are technically accurate but difficult for the average patient to understand, leading to concerns about adherence and informed consent. As an accredited medical writer, how should you approach revising these leaflets to improve patient comprehension while strictly adhering to the relevant regulatory framework for medical device information? Option A. Introduce a narrative or storytelling approach to describe the patient experience with the device, incorporating creative writing techniques to make the information more relatable and memorable. Option B. Maintain the current technical language and structure, as it accurately reflects the device's specifications and is compliant with regulatory requirements, advising stakeholders that patient education is a separate responsibility. Option C. Write the leaflets using more persuasive and engaging language, focusing on the benefits of the device and downplaying technical specifications to make them more appealing to patients. Option D. Prioritize simplifying complex medical terminology and sentence structures, using analogies and visual aids where appropriate to enhance patient understanding, ensuring all simplified explanations remain factually accurate and do not misrepresent the device's intended use or performance according to the approved labeling. Correct answer is D. Prioritize simplifying complex medical terminology and sentence structures, using analogies and visual aids where appropriate to enhance patient understanding, ensuring all simplified explanations remain factually accurate and do not misrepresent the device's intended use or performance according to the approved labeling. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for clear, accurate, and compliant medical information with the desire to engage a diverse audience, including patients and healthcare professionals, who may have varying levels of scientific understanding and different motivations for seeking information. The core tension lies in adhering strictly to the regulatory framework for medical writing, while ensuring the information is accessible and actionable. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the primary regulatory mandate of providing accurate, evidence-based, and compliant information. In the context of medical writing, especially for regulated products or communications, the absolute priority is adherence to the specified regulatory framework. This ensures patient safety, legal compliance, and the integrity of scientific communication. The chosen approach demonstrates an understanding that while engagement is important, it must not compromise the factual accuracy or regulatory standing of the content. It reflects a commitment to the foundational principles of medical writing, which are rooted in scientific rigor and regulatory adherence. An incorrect approach that leans too heavily into creative writing techniques without sufficient grounding in technical accuracy and regulatory compliance would fail by potentially misrepresenting data, overstating benefits, or downplaying risks. This could lead to patient harm, regulatory sanctions, and damage to the reputation of the organization. Specifically, it could violate regulations concerning promotional claims, adverse event reporting, or the accurate portrayal of clinical trial data. Another incorrect approach that focuses solely on technical jargon and complex scientific language, even if accurate, would fail by not being accessible to all intended stakeholders. While technically correct, it would not fulfill the broader communication objective of informing and educating a diverse audience, potentially leading to misunderstanding or non-adherence to treatment recommendations. This failure is not necessarily a direct regulatory violation, but a significant professional and ethical lapse in effective communication. The professional reasoning process should involve a thorough understanding of the target audience, the purpose of the communication, and the applicable regulatory requirements. A medical writer must first identify the core technical and regulatory constraints. Then, they should consider how to present this information in the most accessible and engaging way with an asterisk those constraints. This involves using clear language, appropriate analogies where scientifically sound, and structuring information logically. The decision-making framework should prioritize regulatory compliance and scientific accuracy, followed by clarity and engagement, ensuring that no compromise is made on the former for the sake of the latter. Question 9. The performance metrics show a 15% increase in missing data points for a key secondary endpoint in the last quarter of a clinical trial. Which of the following actions best upholds good clinical practice, GCP, principles in this situation? Option A. Proceed with the current data collection and analysis, noting the increase in missing data in the final report without further investigation. Option B. Focus solely on the primary endpoint data, as the secondary endpoint is less critical, and disregard the trend in missing data for the secondary endpoint. Option C. Proactively impute the missing data points using a statistical method that is not pre-specified in the statistical analysis plan to compensate for the shortfall. Option D. Immediately initiate an investigation into the reasons for the increased missing data, involving the site staff and data management team, and develop a plan for corrective and preventive actions. The correct answer is D. Immediately initiate an investigation into the reasons for the increased missing data, involving the site staff and data management team, and develop a plan for corrective and preventive actions. Explanation. The performance metrics show a concerning trend in the data collection for a clinical trial. Specifically, the rate of missing data points for a key secondary endpoint has increased by 15% in the last quarter compared to the previous 3 quarters. This scenario is professionally challenging because it directly impacts the integrity and reliability of the trial's findings, potentially leading to erroneous conclusions and affecting patient safety and future treatment decisions. Medical writers are responsible for accurately and transparently reporting trial data, and a significant increase in missing data requires immediate and thorough investigation. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the ethical and regulatory imperative to ensure data quality and integrity, as mandated by good clinical practice, GCP principles. This involves a systematic investigation to understand the root cause of the missing data, followed by appropriate corrective and preventive actions. This aligns with GCP E6, R2, Section 4.1.3, which states that the sponsor shall ensure that the clinical trial is conducted, recorded, and performed in accordance with the protocol, this guideline, and applicable regulatory requirements. Transparency and accuracy in reporting are paramount, and addressing data integrity issues proactively is a core responsibility. An incorrect approach that involves simply reporting the observed increase in missing data without investigating the cause is professionally unacceptable. This fails to uphold the GCP principle of ensuring the quality and integrity of the data, GCP E6, R2, Section 4.1.3. It also violates the ethical obligation to be transparent and accurate in reporting, potentially misleading readers about the completeness of the evidence. Another incorrect approach, such as attempting to impute the missing data without a clear, predefined statistical plan and justification, also compromises data integrity. This can introduce bias and misrepresent the true findings of the trial, violating GCP E6, R2, Section 5.15, which emphasizes the importance of statistical analysis plans being finalized prior to unblinding. Furthermore, ignoring the trend and continuing with the current data collection methods without any intervention is a failure to implement adequate quality control measures, which is a fundamental aspect of GCP. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, identify the deviation from expected performance. Second, investigate the root cause of the deviation thoroughly, involving relevant stakeholders, e.g., clinical operations data management. Third, assess the impact of the deviation on data integrity and trial outcomes. Fourth, develop and implement a corrective and preventive action plan. And fifth, document all actions taken and communicate findings transparently in relevant trial documentation. This systematic process ensures that data quality is maintained and that the trial adheres to GCP principles. Question 10. Operational review demonstrates that a medical writer has been asked by a pharmaceutical sponsor to draft a manuscript for publication based on clinical trial data. While the majority of the data supports the efficacy of the investigational drug, a subset of patients experienced a statistically significant, albeit rare, adverse event that was not highlighted in the sponsor's initial summary of findings. The sponsor suggests focusing the manuscript primarily on the positive efficacy outcomes and briefly mentioning the adverse event in a less prominent section, implying it is not a significant concern. What is the most appropriate course of action for the medical writer? Option A. Refuse to draft the manuscript until the sponsor agrees to a narrative that fully prioritizes the statistically significant adverse event above all other findings. Option B. Draft the manuscript to emphasize the positive efficacy outcomes as requested by the sponsor and include a brief, generalized mention of adverse events without detailing the specific statistically significant finding. Option C. Draft the manuscript according to the sponsor's initial suggestion, focusing on efficacy and minimizing the mention of the adverse event, as the sponsor is ultimately responsible for the content. Option D. Draft the manuscript to accurately and comprehensively report all relevant findings, including the statistically significant adverse event, ensuring it is presented with appropriate context and statistical significance, and discuss the presentation with the sponsor. The correct answer is D. Draft the manuscript to accurately and comprehensively report all relevant findings, including the statistically significant adverse event, ensuring it is presented with appropriate context and statistical significance, and discuss the presentation with the sponsor. Explanation. This scenario presents a common ethical dilemma for medical writers, revolving around the integrity of scientific communication and the potential for bias. The challenge lies in balancing the sponsor's objectives with the ethical obligation to present data accurately and objectively, especially when the data might not fully support the intended message. The medical writer must navigate the pressure to present information in a favorable light without misrepresenting the scientific findings. The correct approach prioritizes scientific accuracy and transparency by clearly and accurately reporting all relevant findings, including those that are less favorable. The medical writer upholds the principles of good medical writing and ethical conduct. This aligns with the core responsibilities of a medical writer to ensure that information presented in documents is scientifically sound, evidence-based, and free from undue influence. This approach fosters trust in the scientific record and protects public health by ensuring informed decision-making. An incorrect approach that involves selectively highlighting positive results while downplaying or omitting negative ones constitutes scientific misconduct and a breach of ethical principles. This misrepresentation can mislead readers, including healthcare professionals and regulatory bodies, leading to potentially harmful decisions, undermines the credibility of the writer and the sponsor. Another incorrect approach, that of directly confronting the sponsor with an ultimatum without first attempting a collaborative discussion to find an ethically sound solution, could be perceived as unprofessional and may not achieve the desired outcome of accurate reporting. It fails to explore all avenues for resolving the discrepancy in a constructive manner. A further incorrect approach, that of passively accepting the sponsor's direction without raising concerns, is a failure to uphold professional integrity and ethical responsibilities. This passive compliance can lead to the dissemination of biased or misleading information, which has serious implications for patient safety and scientific progress. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the data thoroughly. They should then engage in a clear, evidence-based discussion with the sponsor, explaining the ethical and scientific imperative for accurate and complete reporting. If disagreements persist, escalating the concern through appropriate internal channels within the company or seeking guidance from professional bodies or ethics committees are crucial steps. The decision-making process should always be guided by a commitment to scientific integrity, transparency, and the ultimate goal of protecting public health. Question 11. The control framework reveals that a sponsor is eager to commence a phase II clinical trial for a novel therapeutic agent and has instructed the medical writing team to expedite the protocol development process. The sponsor's primary concern is to begin site selection and patient recruitment as quickly as possible, suggesting that certain sections of the protocol, such as the detailed statistical analysis plan and the full list of secondary endpoints, can be finalized after recruitment has begun. The medical writer is tasked with advising on the appropriate course of action. Option A. Agree to the sponsor's request to proceed with site selection and recruitment, prioritizing the completion of the protocol's core sections, and assure them that the remaining details will be added as amendments once the study is underway. Option B. Propose a streamlined protocol template that omits detailed descriptions of secondary endpoints and statistical methodologies, allowing for a faster initial draft that can be amended later to include these elements. Option C. Suggest that the medical writer focus on drafting the protocol's narrative sections and delegate the development of the statistical analysis plan and secondary endpoints to the biostatistics team, allowing recruitment to begin while these are being finalized. Option D. Advise the sponsor that all critical sections of the protocol, including the statistical analysis plan and secondary endpoints, must be finalized and approved before any site selection or participant recruitment activities can commence, as per ICH E6R2 GCP guidelines. The correct answer is D. Advise the sponsor that all critical sections of the protocol, including the statistical analysis plan and secondary endpoints, must be finalized and approved before any site selection or participant recruitment activities can commence, as per ICH E6R2 GCP guidelines. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in medical writing, where a sponsor's desire to expedite a study conflicts with the fundamental requirements for a robust and ethically sound clinical study protocol. The pressure to accelerate timelines can lead to shortcuts that compromise scientific integrity, patient safety, and regulatory compliance. The medical writer must navigate this tension by prioritizing protocol quality and adherence to regulatory standards over immediate sponsor demands. The challenge lies in effectively communicating the necessity of thorough protocol development and its downstream implications for study conduct and data integrity, while maintaining a collaborative relationship with the sponsor. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach emphasizes the critical role of a comprehensive protocol in ensuring the scientific validity, ethical conduct, and regulatory compliance of a clinical study. A well-structured protocol, adhering to established guidelines such as ICH E6R2, Good Clinical Practice (GCP) for investigational products, provides a detailed roadmap for the study. This includes clearly defined objectives, endpoints, methodology, participant selection criteria, safety monitoring plans, and data management procedures. By insisting on a complete protocol before initiating site selection and participant recruitment, the medical writer upholds the principles of GCP, protects participant welfare, and ensures the generation of reliable and interpretable data. This proactive stance prevents costly errors, delays, and potential regulatory scrutiny later in the study lifecycle. Incorrect approaches analysis. Proceeding with site selection and participant recruitment based on an incomplete protocol represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This approach violates the core tenets of GCP, which mandate a detailed protocol to guide all aspects of the study. Specifically, it risks inconsistent study conduct. Without clear guidelines on eligibility, interventions, and assessments, sites may interpret and implement study procedures differently, leading to heterogeneous data and compromising the study's internal validity. Compromise participant safety. Inadequate definition of safety monitoring procedures, adverse event reporting, and stopping rules can put participants at risk. Inefficient resource allocation. Initiating recruitment without a finalized protocol can lead to wasted resources on sites that may not be adequately prepared or on participants who may not meet the final inclusion/exclusion criteria. Regulatory noncompliance. Regulatory authorities expect a fully developed protocol to be in place before study initiation. Deviations from this can lead to inspection findings, study holds, or rejection of submitted data. Ethical breaches. The informed consent process relies on accurate and complete information about the study, which is derived from the protocol. An incomplete protocol means participants may not be fully informed about the risks and benefits. Focusing solely on the sponsor's desire for speed without addressing the foundational protocol deficiencies demonstrates a lack of professional judgment and a disregard for the ethical and regulatory obligations inherent in medical writing for clinical research. Professional reasoning. Professionals in medical writing must adopt a decision-making process that prioritizes scientific rigor, ethical conduct, and regulatory compliance. This involves 1. Understanding the regulatory landscape. Thorough knowledge of relevant guidelines, e.g., ICH E6R2 GCP is paramount. 2. Risk assessment. Identifying potential risks associated with deviations from best practices, such as initiating a study with an incomplete protocol. 3. Communication and advocacy. Clearly articulating the rationale behind best practices to stakeholders, including sponsors, and advocating for adherence to established standards. 4. Problem solving. proposing solutions that balance sponsor needs with regulatory and ethical requirements, such as suggesting a phased approach to protocol development or prioritizing critical sections for immediate finalization. 5. Professional integrity, maintaining an unwavering commitment to ethical principles and regulatory compliance, even under pressure. Question 12. Governance review demonstrates that a medical writing team is preparing an abstract for a major international oncology conference. The study involves a novel therapeutic agent, and preliminary data shows a promising trend in patient response. However, the full dataset is still undergoing final statistical analysis, and some secondary endpoints have not yet been definitively assessed. The conference deadline is rapidly approaching, and the team is under pressure to submit a compelling abstract. What is the most appropriate course of action for the medical writing team? Option A. Include extrapolated findings and projections based on the promising trend, even though the full statistical analysis is not complete, to create a more impactful abstract. Option B. Delay submission until the full dataset is analyzed and all endpoints are definitively assessed, even if this means missing the conference deadline, to ensure the most robust and complete abstract. Option C. Submit the abstract with only the most positive preliminary findings, omitting any mention of ongoing analysis or unconfirmed secondary endpoints to maximize the chances of acceptance. Option D. Submit the abstract with the available preliminary data, clearly indicating that the full analysis is ongoing and that secondary endpoints are not yet finalized. Ensure all co-authors have reviewed and approved the abstract's content and caveats. The correct answer is D. Submit the abstract with the available preliminary data, clearly indicating that the full analysis is ongoing and that secondary endpoints are not yet finalized. Ensure all co-authors have reviewed and approved the abstract's content and caveats. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in medical writing, where the need to disseminate research findings at a conference clashes with the strict requirements for abstract submission and the ethical imperative to accurately represent data. The pressure to present novel findings, coupled with potential time constraints, can lead to decisions that compromise scientific integrity or regulatory compliance. The challenge lies in balancing the desire for timely communication with the obligation to adhere to established guidelines and ethical standards. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes adherence to the specific conference's abstract submission guidelines and the regulatory framework governing medical publications. This involves ensuring that the abstract accurately reflects the study's methodology, results, and conclusions, without overstating findings or including data that has not yet been fully analyzed or validated. It also necessitates ensuring that all authors have reviewed and approved the abstract, a critical step in maintaining scientific accountability and preventing misrepresentation. This aligns with the principles of good publication practice and the ethical obligations of medical writers and researchers to present information truthfully and transparently. Incorrect approach is analysis. An approach that submits an abstract with preliminary or extrapolated data without clear caveats or without full author approval represents a significant ethical and potentially regulatory failure. This can lead to the dissemination of misleading information, damage the reputation of the researchers and institutions involved, and undermine the scientific discourse at the conference. Violates the principle of scientific accuracy and honesty. An approach that prioritizes the inclusion of exciting but unverified findings over the strict adherence to submission deadlines or the requirement for full data analysis demonstrates a disregard for established processes and ethical standards. This can result in the submission of incomplete or inaccurate information, which is detrimental to the scientific community and the integrity of the conference. An approach that omits crucial methodological details or limitations to make the abstract more concise or impactful, without ensuring that the core findings are still accurately represented, is also problematic. While conciseness is important, it should not come at the expense of scientific rigor and transparency. This can lead to misinterpretation of the study's significance and applicability. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the specific conference's abstract guidelines and any relevant regulatory requirements. This involves a systematic review of the study data to ensure its accuracy and completeness for the intended abstract. A critical step is to engage in open communication with all co-authors, ensuring consensus on the content and conclusions presented. If there are any uncertainties or if the data is preliminary, the abstract should clearly state this. The decision-making process should always prioritize scientific integrity, ethical conduct, and regulatory compliance over expediency or the desire for sensationalism. Question 13. The risk matrix shows a potential for significant delay in regulatory submission if the core document lacks sufficient detail regarding the mechanism of action. The client, a small biotechnology startup, is eager to expedite the process and has requested that the medical writer focus primarily on summarizing the clinical efficacy data, suggesting that the mechanism of action can be elaborated upon in a subsequent, separate document intended for a different audience. The medical writer is tasked with preparing a pivotal clinical study report for a major regulatory authority. What is the most appropriate approach for the medical writer in this situation? Option A. Include a brief, high-level overview of the mechanism of action in the clinical study report, acknowledging that a more detailed explanation will be provided in a future document, and proceed with the efficacy data summary. Option B. Integrate a comprehensive explanation of the mechanism of action into the clinical study report, drawing from all available preclinical and clinical data, and clearly delineating the scientific rationale, even if it requires additional time and resources beyond the initial scope. Option C. Delegate the detailed research and writing of the mechanism of action section to a junior associate in the marketing department who has some scientific background to expedite the process. Option D. Focus exclusively on summarizing the clinical efficacy data as requested by the client, deferring the detailed mechanism of action explanation to a separate document, and proceeding with the submission timeline. The correct answer is B. Integrate a comprehensive explanation of the mechanism of action into the clinical study report, drawing from all available preclinical and clinical data, and clearly delineating the scientific rationale, even if it requires additional time and resources beyond the initial scope. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent ambiguity in defining the precise scope of medical writing within a regulated environment. The pressure to deliver a comprehensive document while adhering to strict regulatory definitions and avoiding overreach requires careful judgment. The medical writer must balance the client's perceived needs with the established boundaries of their professional role and the regulatory expectations for specific document types. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it aligns with the fundamental principles of medical writing as defined by regulatory frameworks and professional bodies. Medical writing, in this context, is understood as the creation of clear, accurate, and compliant documents for regulatory submission, scientific communication, or patient information. This involves interpreting complex scientific and clinical data and presenting it in a format that meets specific regulatory requirements. By focusing on the core competencies of medical writing data interpretation, regulatory compliance, and clear communication, the writer ensures the document serves its intended purpose without venturing into areas that require different expertise or fall outside the established scope of medical writing. This upholds the integrity of the medical writing profession and ensures the submitted documentation is fit for purpose and compliant. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that involves extensively researching and including marketing claims, even if based on preliminary data, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Medical writing, particularly for regulatory submissions, is distinct from promotional writing. Regulatory documents must be objective, evidence-based, and free from unsubstantiated claims. Including marketing-oriented content blurs these lines, potentially leading to non-compliance with advertising and promotion regulations, and undermining the scientific integrity of the submission. An approach that focuses solely on the client's immediate request without considering the broader regulatory context or the established definition of medical writing is also professionally unacceptable. While client satisfaction is important, it cannot supersede regulatory compliance and ethical obligations. Medical writers are expected to advise clients on appropriate documentation and content based on regulatory requirements, not simply execute requests that may be misaligned with these standards. This failure to exercise professional judgment can lead to the creation of documents that are inadequate for their intended regulatory purpose or even misleading. An approach that delegates significant portions of the writing to individuals without the specific expertise or regulatory understanding of medical writing is another critical failure. Medical writing requires a unique blend of scientific knowledge, regulatory awareness, and communication skills. Outsourcing core medical writing tasks to unqualified personnel risks inaccuracies, non-compliance, and ultimately, the rejection or delay of regulatory submissions. This undermines the quality and reliability of the documentation. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance, scientific accuracy, and ethical conduct. This involves 1. Clearly understanding the purpose and intended audience of the document. 2. Consulting relevant regulatory guidelines and definitions for the specific jurisdiction. 3. Identifying the core competencies and scope of medical writing. 4. Evaluating client requests against these established parameters. 5. Proactively advising clients on appropriate content and documentation strategies based on regulatory requirements. 6. Collaborating with subject matter experts when necessary, but retaining responsibility for the medical writing aspects. 7. Documenting decisions and rationale, especially when deviating from or clarifying client requests based on regulatory considerations. Question 14. The assessment process reveals that a medical writing team is tasked with developing a comprehensive package of information for a new pharmaceutical product. This package must serve 3 distinct audiences: regulatory authorities, specifically the MHRA, healthcare professionals, and patients. The team is considering how to best tailor the content for each group. Which of the following approaches best addresses the implementation challenge of audience analysis while adhering to regulatory and ethical standards? Option A. Prioritize patient understanding by using simplified language and visuals in all communications, even if it means omitting some of the detailed scientific evidence required by regulatory authorities and healthcare professionals. Option B. Create separate documents for each audience, ensuring that the content, language, and level of detail are specifically adapted to their respective knowledge, needs, and the regulatory requirements for each communication channel. Option C. Develop a single, highly detailed scientific document that includes all raw data and technical specifications, and then provide a brief summary for patients and a slightly abridged version for healthcare professionals. Option D. Focus primarily on the scientific accuracy and completeness of the information, assuming that all audiences will be able to interpret the technical language and complex data presented. Correct answer is C. Develop a single, highly detailed scientific document that includes all raw data and technical specifications, and then provide a brief summary for patients and a slightly abridged version for healthcare professionals. Explanation. This scenario presents a common implementation challenge in medical writing, adapting complex scientific information for diverse audiences while adhering to strict regulatory requirements. The challenge lies in balancing scientific accuracy and completeness with clarity and accessibility for each stakeholder group, ensuring that the communication is not only understood, but also meets its intended purpose and complies with all applicable regulations. The correct approach prioritizes understanding the specific needs, knowledge levels, and regulatory obligations of each stakeholder group. For a regulatory submission, this means adhering strictly to the format and content requirements of the relevant regulatory body, e.g., MHRA in the UK. For patient information, it necessitates clear, jargon-free language that empowers patients to make informed decisions, while still being medically accurate and not misleading. For healthcare professionals, the content needs to be detailed enough to support clinical decision-making, referencing appropriate scientific evidence and clinical trial data. This tailored approach ensures compliance, promotes effective communication, and upholds ethical standards by providing relevant and understandable information to each audience. An incorrect approach might involve using a single, highly technical document for all audiences. This fails to meet the needs of patients who require simplified language and may not have a scientific background. It also risks overwhelming or confusing healthcare professionals if the document is not structured to highlight key clinical information. Furthermore, submitting a document that does not conform to the specific formatting and content guidelines of a regulatory agency, e.g., the MHRA for the UK, would be a direct violation of regulatory requirements, potentially leading to delays, rejection, or further scrutiny. Another failure would be to oversimplify information to the point of losing critical scientific nuance or omitting essential data required by regulators or healthcare professionals, which could be considered misleading or incomplete. The professional decision-making process should begin with a thorough analysis of the intended audiences and the purpose of the communication. For each audience, identify their existing knowledge base, their specific information needs, and any regulatory or ethical constraints that apply. Develop a communication strategy that outlines how the core scientific information will be adapted for each group. This involves selecting appropriate language, tone, and level of detail, and ensuring that all adaptations remain scientifically accurate and ethically sound. Regular review and feedback from subject matter experts and representatives of the target audiences are crucial to ensure the effectiveness and compliance of the final communication. Question 15. Assessment of a medical writer's strategy for ensuring a clinical study report adheres strictly to the International Council for Harmonization, IC, E3 guideline for structure and content of clinical study reports, when faced with a draft that incorporates elements from a previous, similar submission. Option A. Rely on the collective memory and experience of the medical writing team regarding ICH E3 compliance, as they have successfully submitted similar reports in the past. Option B. Assume the previous submission structure and content are largely compliant with ICH E3 and make only minor edits to reflect new data, focusing on narrative flow and readability. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive line-by-line review of the draft report against the ICH E3 guideline, cross-referencing each section to ensure all specified content is present, accurately represented, and formatted according to the guideline's recommendations, while also noting any deviations and their justifications. Option D. Prioritize the visual appeal and user-friendliness of the report, making adaptations to the ICH E3 structure if it improves the overall presentation and perceived clarity for the reader. The correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive line-by-line review of the draft report against the ICH E3 guideline, cross-referencing each section to ensure all specified content is present, accurately represented, and formatted according to the guideline's recommendations, while also noting any deviations and their justifications. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in medical writing, where a medical writer must balance the need for scientific accuracy and clarity with the specific requirements of a regulatory submission. The challenge lies in interpreting and applying complex guidelines to a real-world document, ensuring compliance without compromising the integrity or readability of the information. Careful judgment is required to navigate potential ambiguities in the guidelines and to make informed decisions that uphold both scientific standards and regulatory expectations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough understanding and direct application of the specified regulatory framework. By meticulously reviewing the relevant sections of the guidelines and cross-referencing them with the draft document, the medical writer ensures that all requirements are addressed. This systematic process minimizes the risk of omissions or misinterpretations, leading to a submission that is compliant and robust. Adherence to the specific regulatory framework is paramount in medical writing, as deviations can lead to significant delays, rejection of submissions, or even regulatory action. This approach demonstrates a commitment to scientific integrity and regulatory compliance, which are foundational ethical obligations for accredited medical writers. An incorrect approach that involves relying solely on previous experience without consulting the current guidelines is professionally unacceptable. This fails to acknowledge that regulatory frameworks are dynamic and subject to updates. Such an approach risks non-compliance with the latest requirements, potentially leading to the submission being deemed inadequate. It also demonstrates a lack of diligence and a failure to uphold the professional standard of staying current with relevant regulations. Another incorrect approach, which is to interpret the guidelines based on industry best practices rather than their explicit wording, is also professionally flawed. While industry best practices are valuable, they are not a substitute for the specific, legally binding requirements of a regulatory framework. This approach can lead to misinterpretations and omissions, as industry norms may not perfectly align with the precise stipulations of the governing body. It bypasses the critical step of direct regulatory engagement. A further incorrect approach, such as prioritizing the aesthetic presentation of the document over strict adherence to the guidelines' content requirements, is fundamentally misguided. While a well-presented document is desirable, regulatory compliance is the primary objective. Aesthetic considerations should never supersede the accurate and complete fulfillment of regulatory mandates. This approach demonstrates a misunderstanding of the core purpose of regulatory medical writing and its ethical imperatives. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a systematic, multi-step approach. First, identify the specific regulatory framework applicable to the document. Second, thoroughly read and understand the relevant sections of the guidelines, paying close attention to detail and any stated exceptions or clarifications. Third, meticulously compare the draft document against each requirement of the guidelines, documenting any discrepancies or areas needing attention. Fourth, consult with subject matter experts or regulatory affairs colleagues if any ambiguities arise. Finally, ensure that all identified issues are addressed and documented before finalizing the submission. This structured approach ensures that all regulatory obligations are met with precision and integrity. Question 16. Comparative studies suggest that while sponsors often aim to accelerate drug development timelines, the sequential nature of clinical trial phases is critical for ensuring both scientific validity and participant safety. A sponsor is seeking to move directly from a completed phase I trial to a phase III trial for a novel oncology therapeutic, arguing that the phase I safety data is highly encouraging and that the potential market need is urgent. They propose designing the phase III trial to include exploratory endpoints that could capture early signs of efficacy, effectively attempting to fulfill some phase II objectives within the larger phase III study. From a regulatory and ethical standpoint, what is the most appropriate course of action for the medical writer to advise? Option A. Recommend merging phase I and phase III, suggesting that the phase I safety data can be extrapolated to inform the phase III design, and that any safety signals emerging in phase III can be managed through adaptive trial modifications. Option B. Support the sponsor's proposal, emphasizing that the urgency of the medical need and the positive phase I safety data justify an expedited approach, and that exploratory endpoints in phase III can adequately address efficacy concerns. Option C. Propose that the sponsor conduct a limited, informal assessment of efficacy in a small subset of phase I participants before initiating phase III to provide some preliminary efficacy indication. Option D. Advise the sponsor that proceeding directly to phase III without a dedicated phase II study is not permissible, as phase II is essential for establishing preliminary efficacy and further refining the safety profile in the target patient population before exposing a larger group. The correct answer is D. Advise the sponsor that proceeding directly to phase III without a dedicated phase II study is not permissible, as phase II is essential for establishing preliminary efficacy and further refining the safety profile in the target patient population before exposing a larger group. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in medical writing where a sponsor, eager to advance a promising drug, seeks to expedite the transition from phase II to phase III trials. The pressure to demonstrate efficacy and safety quickly can lead to proposals that, while seemingly efficient, may compromise the scientific rigor and ethical integrity of the trial process. The medical writer must navigate the sponsor's commercial imperatives with the stringent regulatory requirements and ethical obligations governing clinical research. The core challenge lies in balancing the desire for speed with the absolute necessity of robust data generation and participant safety, ensuring that each phase fulfills its distinct objectives before proceeding. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach emphasizes the distinct and sequential objectives of each clinical trial phase as mandated by regulatory frameworks such as those governing the Accredited in Medical Writing (AMW) exam, which aligns with established good clinical practice (GCP) principles. Phase I focuses on safety and dosage in a small group of healthy volunteers or patients. Phase II assesses efficacy and further evaluates safety in a larger group of patients with the target condition. Phase III is designed to confirm efficacy, monitor side effects, compare it to commonly used treatments, and collect information that will allow the drug or treatment to be used safely. Proceeding to phase Roman 3 without adequately addressing the objectives of phase Roman 2, particularly regarding preliminary efficacy signals and a well-defined safety profile, would be premature. This approach upholds the regulatory requirement for a stepwise, evidence-based progression, ensuring that decisions to advance are supported by sufficient data to protect future participants and maintain scientific validity. It aligns with the ethical imperative to avoid exposing a larger population to a treatment whose benefits have not been sufficiently demonstrated or whose risks are not yet adequately understood. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves proposing to merge the objectives of phase Roman 2 and phase Roman 3, perhaps by designing a phase Roman 3 trial that incorporates elements of efficacy assessment typically found in phase Roman 2. This is a regulatory failure because it bypasses the established sequential nature of clinical development, which is designed to build evidence incrementally. It risks generating confounded data, making it difficult to attribute outcomes definitively to the drug's efficacy or to identify specific safety concerns that might have been clearer in a more focused phase Roman 2 study. Ethically, it exposes a larger participant pool to a treatment whose efficacy is not yet robustly established, potentially leading to false hope or unnecessary exposure to risks. Another incorrect approach is to argue that if phase I shows acceptable safety, the trial can proceed directly to phase Roman 3, skipping phase Roman 2 entirely. This is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Phase I is primarily about safety and pharmacokinetics in a limited population. It does not provide the necessary data on efficacy in patients with the disease, which is the fundamental purpose of phase Roman 2. Skipping phase Roman 2 means that the drug's potential benefit in the target population remains unproven, and the safety profile in patients with the condition, who may react differently than healthy volunteers, is not adequately assessed. This approach disregards the critical need to establish a preliminary signal of efficacy before embarking on large-scale, expensive phase Roman 3 trials, which are designed to confirm what has already been suggested in earlier phases. A third incorrect approach might involve focusing solely on the speed of market entry and suggesting that any observed positive trends in phase Roman 2 can be further explored and confirmed within the phase Roman 3 trial itself, even if the phase Roman 2 data is not conclusive. This is a failure to adhere to the scientific and regulatory expectation that phase Roman 2 should provide sufficient evidence to justify the significant investment and participant exposure of phase Roman 3. While phase Roman 3 trials do confirm efficacy, they are not intended to be exploratory in the same way as phase Roman 2. Relying on phase Roman 3 to discover efficacy is a misapplication of the trial phases, potentially leading to inconclusive phase Roman 3 results or the approval of a drug with marginal or unproven benefit, which is both a regulatory and ethical concern. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that prioritizes scientific integrity and regulatory compliance. When faced with sponsor pressure to accelerate timelines, the medical writer must clearly articulate the distinct purpose and data requirements of each trial phase. This involves referencing relevant regulatory guidelines, e.g., ICGCP E6, R2, and ethical principles. The process should involve 1. Understanding the sponsor's objective and the scientific rationale for the proposed change. 2. Thoroughly reviewing the data from the preceding phase to assess whether its objectives have been met. 3. Consulting relevant regulatory guidance to confirm the requirements for proceeding to the next phase. 4. Clearly communicating to the sponsor the regulatory and ethical implications of any proposed deviation from standard trial progression, emphasizing the risks of compromised data integrity and participant safety. 5. Proposing alternative strategies for efficiency that do not compromise scientific rigor, such as optimizing trial design within the established phase structure or exploring adaptive trial designs where appropriate and permissible. Question 17. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a medical writer is preparing a manuscript for submission to a high-impact biomedical journal. The journal's instructions for authors are available but are quite detailed and include specific requirements for figure formatting, reference citation style, and a strict word limit for the abstract. The medical writer has also observed that the lead author prefers a particular way of presenting statistical results, and the journal's most recent issue features several articles with a slightly unconventional introduction structure. Considering these factors, which approach to manuscript preparation is most likely to ensure successful submission and publication. Option A. Strictly adhere to the target journal's instructions for authors, prioritizing its specific formatting and content requirements above all other considerations. Option B. Utilize a generic scientific manuscript template that covers the standard AMRAD structure, as this is universally accepted. Option C. Primarily follow the lead author's preferred method for presenting statistical results, as their experience is invaluable. Option D. Emulate the unconventional introduction structure seen in the most recent issue of the journal, assuming this reflects current editorial trends. The correct answer is A. Strictly adhere to the target journal's instructions for authors, prioritizing its specific formatting and content requirements above all other considerations. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a medical writer to navigate the nuanced requirements of scientific journal submissions while adhering to the specific, often unwritten, expectations of journal editors and peer reviewers. The challenge lies in balancing the need for comprehensive scientific reporting with the practical constraints of journal formatting and the implicit understanding of what constitutes a standard manuscript structure. Misinterpreting or ignoring these expectations can lead to rejection, significant delays, and damage to the author's reputation. Careful judgment is required to anticipate editorial preferences and to present data and findings in a manner that is both scientifically rigorous and editorially acceptable. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes adherence to the specific instructions provided by the target journal. Scientific journals, while generally following a standardized structure, AMRAD, have unique formatting guidelines, word limits, and preferred styles for presenting data, references, and figures. A medical writer's primary responsibility is to ensure the manuscript meets these explicit requirements. This demonstrates professionalism, respect for the editorial process, and an understanding that the manuscript is being submitted for publication in a specific venue. Adhering to journal guidelines is a fundamental ethical obligation to the journal and its readership, ensuring clarity and consistency. Incorrect approach is analysis. An incorrect approach that relies solely on a generic template without consulting the target journal's specific instructions fails to acknowledge the individuality of publication venues. This can lead to noncompliance with critical formatting rules, such as reference style, figure resolution, or word count limitations, which are often grounds for immediate rejection. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and disrespect for the editorial process. Another incorrect approach, focusing exclusively on the most recent publication by the lead author, is problematic because it assumes that the lead author's personal preferences or past practices will align with the target journal's current requirements. While author preferences can be a factor, they are secondary to the journal's explicit guidelines. This approach risks submitting a manuscript that is not tailored to the intended publication outlet, potentially leading to rejection due to stylistic or structural mismatches. Finally, an approach that prioritizes the inclusion of every piece of data collected, regardless of its relevance to the core research question or the journal's scope, is also incorrect. While thoroughness is important, scientific manuscripts require conciseness and focus. Journals have limited space, and editors expect authors to present the most impactful and relevant findings. Overloading the manuscript with extraneous data can obscure the main message, frustrate reviewers, and lead to rejection for lack of clarity or focus, violating the principle of effective scientific communication. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic approach when preparing manuscripts for scientific journals. This involves 1. Thoroughly reviewing the target journal's instructions for authors or author guidelines as the primary source of truth. 2. Understanding the general structure of scientific manuscripts, e.g., AMRAD, as a foundational framework. 3. Consulting with the study's principal investigators and co-authors to understand their specific expectations and the key messages they wish to convey. 4. Prioritizing clarity, conciseness, and logical flow of information. 5. Tailoring the manuscript structure, formatting, and content to meet both the journal's requirements and the scientific narrative. This iterative process ensures that the manuscript is scientifically sound, ethically presented, and optimized for publication in the chosen venue. Question 18. To address the challenge of adapting a complex clinical trial report for both a peer-reviewed journal and a patient information leaflet, which writing style and technique would best ensure accurate yet accessible communication. Option A. Employing a layered approach, using clear, concise language and visual aids for the patient leaflet while retaining detailed scientific terminology and statistical analysis for the journal, ensuring each version is tailored to its specific audience's comprehension level and information needs. Option B. Presenting the full, unedited clinical trial report with all technical jargon and complex statistical analyses for both the journal and the patient leaflet, assuming the audience can interpret the information independently. Option C. Condensing the entire clinical trial report into a brief summary, using simplified language for both the journal and the patient leaflet, omitting detailed methodologies and statistical nuances to improve readability. Option D. Rewriting the clinical trial report to emphasize only the positive outcomes and statistically significant findings, omitting any data that might suggest limitations or less favorable results for both the journal and the patient leaflet. The correct answer is A. Employing a layered approach, using clear, concise language and visual aids for the patient leaflet while retaining detailed scientific terminology and statistical analysis for the journal, ensuring each version is tailored to its specific audience's comprehension level and information needs. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between achieving clarity and conciseness in medical writing, particularly when adapting complex scientific data for different audiences. The need to maintain scientific accuracy while ensuring accessibility requires careful consideration of writing styles and techniques. The Accredited in Medical Writing (AMW) framework emphasizes adherence to ethical standards and regulatory compliance, which includes presenting information truthfully and without misleading the reader. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a nuanced adaptation of language and structure to suit the intended audience, a core tenet of effective medical communication. This involves understanding the audience's existing knowledge base and tailoring the level of technical detail accordingly. It aligns with the AMW's emphasis on clear, accurate, and audience-appropriate communication, ensuring that the information is both understood and actionable. This approach upholds the ethical obligation to disseminate scientific knowledge responsibly. An incorrect approach that oversimplifies to the point of losing critical nuance fails to meet the standard of scientific accuracy. This can lead to misinterpretation and potentially harmful decisions if the simplified information omits essential caveats or context. Such an approach risks violating ethical principles of truthfulness and accuracy in scientific reporting. Another incorrect approach that retains excessive technical jargon, even when targeting a lay audience, fails in the fundamental goal of clear communication. This can alienate the reader, render the information inaccessible, and ultimately be ineffective. While it may preserve technical accuracy, it sacrifices the clarity and understanding required for responsible dissemination of medical information, potentially leading to a failure to inform. A third incorrect approach that selectively omits data to create a more favorable impression, even if technically accurate in what is presented, is ethically unsound. This constitutes a form of bias that can mislead the audience and undermine the integrity of the medical information. It violates the ethical imperative for complete and unbiased reporting of scientific findings. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough audience analysis, a clear understanding of the communication objectives, and a commitment to maintaining scientific integrity. Medical writers must critically evaluate their chosen writing style and techniques, ensuring they strike a balance between accuracy, clarity, and ethical responsibility, always prioritizing the reader's comprehension and the truthful representation of scientific data. Question 19. Cost-benefit analysis shows that developing separate, tailored communication materials for healthcare professionals and patients is more resource-intensive than creating a single, generalized document. Which approach best upholds the principles of effective medical communication and regulatory compliance for a new oncology drug? Option A. Produce a highly technical document for healthcare professionals and assume patients will seek further clarification from their doctors. Option B. Develop a single document that uses simplified language and avoids technical jargon, suitable for a broad audience. Option C. Rely on healthcare professionals to interpret and translate complex scientific data into patient-friendly language during consultations. Option D. Create two distinct sets of materials. One comprehensive document for healthcare professionals and a separate, simplified patient information leaflet. The correct answer is B. Develop a single document that uses simplified language and avoids technical jargon, suitable for a broad audience. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because medical writers must balance the need for scientific accuracy and detail when communicating with healthcare professionals against the imperative to present information clearly and accessibly to patients. The core challenge lies in tailoring complex medical information to different levels of understanding without compromising integrity or efficacy. Careful judgment is required to ensure that both audiences receive information that is appropriate, understandable, and ethically sound. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes patient comprehension and safety while maintaining scientific rigor. By developing distinct materials for each audience, medical writers adhere to ethical guidelines that mandate clear communication and patient empowerment. This strategy ensures that healthcare professionals receive the detailed, nuanced information necessary for clinical decision-making, while patients receive information that is understandable, actionable, and supports informed consent and adherence to treatment. This aligns with principles of good medical practice and regulatory expectations for patient information. An incorrect approach that fails to differentiate content for healthcare professionals and patients risks either overwhelming patients with technical jargon or oversimplifying information to the point of being misleading for clinicians. Regulatory failures for such approaches could include violations of patient information standards, which require information to be comprehensible. Ethically, it breaches the duty to communicate effectively with both groups, potentially leading to misinformed decisions, reduced treatment adherence, and compromised patient safety. Another incorrect approach might involve using overly promotional language in materials intended for healthcare professionals, which is a breach of scientific integrity and regulatory guidelines against misleading claims. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the intended audience's literacy, existing knowledge, and information needs. This requires a clear definition of the purpose of the communication and the desired outcome for each audience. Medical writers should consult with subject matter experts and, where appropriate, patient advocacy groups to ensure the accuracy and appropriateness of the content. A systematic review process that includes checks for clarity, accuracy, and regulatory compliance for each distinct audience is crucial. Question 20. Benchmark analysis indicates that a medical writer is tasked with creating a patient information leaflet for a new medication. The writer has a draft that is scientifically accurate but uses numerous complex medical terms. What is the most appropriate approach to ensure effective communication and patient understanding? Option A. Retain the scientifically accurate terminology and include a comprehensive glossary at the end of the leaflet to define all technical terms. Option B. Assume patients have a sufficient understanding of medical terminology and proceed with the scientifically accurate draft as is. Option C. Replace all complex medical terms with simpler, everyday language, even if it slightly compromises the precise scientific meaning. Option D. Revise the draft to use clear, accessible language, defining or explaining any necessary technical terms in context, and using simpler synonyms where appropriate without sacrificing essential accuracy. Correct answer is A. Retain the scientifically accurate terminology and include a comprehensive glossary at the end of the leaflet to define all technical terms. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between conveying precise scientific information and ensuring accessibility to a diverse audience, particularly in the context of medical writing, where clarity can directly impact patient understanding and adherence to treatment. The Accredited in Medical Writing (AMW) framework, while not explicitly detailed here as a specific jurisdiction, implies adherence to general principles of good medical communication, ethical practice, and regulatory compliance relevant to the medical field. The core challenge lies in balancing the need for technical accuracy with the imperative of avoiding jargon that could alienate or confuse non-expert readers, such as patients or healthcare professionals in different specialties. The correct approach emphasizes the strategic use of terminology, prioritizing clarity and audience comprehension. This aligns with best professional practice in medical writing by ensuring that the intended message is effectively communicated, minimizing the risk of misinterpretation. Ethically, this approach upholds the principle of beneficence by aiming to inform and empower the reader, rather than obscure or mislead. From a regulatory perspective, clear communication is often implicitly or explicitly required to ensure informed consent, patient safety, and compliance with guidelines promoting health literacy. Incorrect approaches fail to adequately address the audience's needs or the purpose of the communication. Over-reliance on highly technical jargon without explanation can lead to a failure to communicate effectively, potentially violating ethical obligations to inform and potentially leading to non-compliance with regulatory expectations for clear and understandable health information. Conversely, oversimplification to the point of losing scientific accuracy can also be problematic, as it may misrepresent the information and lead to incorrect understanding or decisions. The failure to consider the audience's background knowledge and the specific context of the document is a critical flaw. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough audience analysis. This includes identifying the primary readers, their level of expertise, and their likely purpose in engaging with the document. The writer must then select terminology that is appropriate for that audience, defining or explaining any necessary technical terms. The purpose of the document, e.g., patient information leaflet, clinical trial protocol, scientific publication, will dictate the acceptable level of technicality. A risk assessment should be conducted to identify potential areas of confusion or misinterpretation and mitigation strategies implemented, such as glossaries, simplified explanations, or visual aids.